I think there are several things I at least have seen that produce what on the surface look like trouble. And I guess I want to actually challenge the frame of is the trouble really trouble? Or is it actually creative opportunity? I think in this kind of creative work, one has to do what we would call predict and manage regression. This is also known as 3 steps forward, 4 steps back. And often people see movement in that way as evidence of slipping back or failing. And I want to suggest that I don't think that's actually accurate. I think you wouldn't fall back if you went to go forward. And I think there's something about the habits that we're at a deeper level seeking to transform, individually and collectively, that have to get addressed if we're going to actually create something of a different order of things. So we sometimes talk about this as shifting the muscle memory of organizations. I think there are all kinds of very deep habits that have been ingrained, validated, trumpeted, and so on.
So this VUCA world, volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous, that's the beginning of what you were referring to as the dark side. There's a lesson coming out of it in the companies I'm working with, a very clear lesson about what strategies work in a VUCA world. And the strategies that work all have the same characteristic. You've got leaders that are very clear where they're going, but very flexible about how they get there. So as the phrase I use in the talk about it's like taking small staccato steps through sharp rocks and rapid prototyping your way to innovation. So it's a completely different mentality than the problem solver mentality. And today's generation of leaders were mostly trained to problem solve. So to be able to address these dilemmas, essentially problems that can't be solved, that's what the VUCA world is. You have to be able to embrace that uncertainty and then flip it into a leadership opportunity. So the reality of it that we're going to talk about now is this reality of the VUCA world. And it has to be accepted as a permanently VUCA world. Who would have thought of a cloud? I'm just rolling through my mind now about how I'm going to get to my next stop. And all of us are. So we're all going to have to be able to do this stuff in real time. So the VUCA world for us now is a volcano cloud. That wasn't even on my event horizon until Nick mentioned that. And now that's shaping our lives. So each of us has to figure out how we accept that VUCA world and then flip it.
I thought the VUCA idea is an amazing idea. First time I heard it, I have to admit. Love it, we'll embrace it forever, but it makes me afraid. So I think of it, it's like a, oh shit. Supposed to have to edit that out too. But the sense of fear when confronted with that, but my corporate experience is that there's a tremendous amount of fear in people's experience all the time. So even companies that, and I've worked for some that were seen from the outside world as being very prominent and successful in their own business, there was a sense of overwhelming fear that that would not continue, that the strategic direction wouldn't work, that someone else would win. And then there was a sense of overwhelming fear at the organizational and individual level that I wouldn't get ahead, I wouldn't succeed, my division wouldn't do well, I wouldn't meet my targets, I might lose a political battle, whatever it is. So the overriding notion of fear as something which puts me in protect mode and makes me very unable to think new thoughts, take risks, risk failure, try new ideas, be vulnerable.
And while we're on the emotions, Bill this morning mentioned fear and shame. And I was linking the shame to the achiever, because I think a lot of achievers have very shame-based dynamic in them. And so it's not just sort of fear of failure, because you can get some arguments about how you'll learn from it and so on, but it's the shame of failing. And I think that constrains innovation.
So there's those things. There's also a whole lot of stuff that people are trained to do as to how to collapse and disable innovation, isn't there? So target setting, let's have some stretch targets, because if we don't have stretch targets, you might do something interesting. Let's make sure, it's not actually, now I say it, I realise it's not completely unrelated to fear and shame either, but it's there's managerial processes by which we say that this group of people, we've given them a budget, so we better wait and see how what they've produced for us stacks up to that budget. We will manage that process, and that's just a great way of collapsing and disabling any culture of innovation.
And that's because those systems are built out of people's anxiety. So so they have a fear about something, and they build a system that they believe exercises control. And the impact, and it's just a very, and we're still kind of working through what that means and the implications, what we've learned out of that. But that threat is there, that when you innovate, the system can really come in and crush it.
While we're talking about fear, anxiety, shame and so on, however, we mustn't forget smugness and complacency, which can also operate to dampen innovation, and which a lot of these systems of which you speak were invented to counteract, weren't they? So you've got that sense sometimes that people notice one set of syndromes and invent a system to try to counter it, and in doing so, the law of unintended consequences clicks in, and you've got another set of systems which also has a negative effect.
I think that kind of fits in with what I was talking about earlier about being clear about direction but flexible about how that's implemented. One of my favorite examples is when Procter & Gamble went open in their R&D approach. A.G. Lafley, the CEO at the time, was very clear about the fact that half the new ideas had to come from the outside. And he said, I'm going to track you, I'm going to measure you, and I'm going to publicly announce when you reach that goal. But it's up to you to figure out how to do it. So there was great innovation that happened within the structure of that clarity of direction. So it seems if you can create that great clarity, that creates that space with which innovation can happen.
Depends on the level that we're talking. We're thinking for the minute about organizational systems. I mean, I've been thinking lately that each system I encounter has a kind of, you're sometimes calling it their kryptonite, you know, something they just can't do. And trying to get them to do that is futile because they resist it. So there's some other developmental pathway to sort of articulate or create here. There's one organization I'm thinking of that has massive amounts of gold, you know, not like gold in the form of knowledge and sort of leadership to offer to the world. And they are terrible at telling their story. I mean, remarkably terrible. Systematically prevented themselves from doing it and limited their own expansion, limited the world's awareness of them and benefit from them and so on. And being confidently and unified in pride at what they do is their kryptonite. They cannot do it. And I have a feeling that there's sort of kryptonite in lots of these cultures, different kinds of kryptonite. You know, some cultures can't get their organizational performance act together. They're overdo it or they underdo it or whatever. So I think there are different elements here that might be worth you know, surfacing. What are some of these sort of system level patterns and how do we release them?
I think that some of those are certainly also linked to this collective memory, and sometimes it becomes this self-fulfilling prophecy because they have never been good at it and therefore don't try it again in this organization because it will fail. And it's kind of how do you break through that self-fulfilling prophecy? So yes, there is some kryptonite, but some are also self-invented or collective envisioned kryptonite.
I think there's also this, it's been referred to a couple of times already, the lack of purpose, I think. I think people who have a genuine belief in something they're about and what it is they're looking to do is highly motivating for change and creativity. And if there's a lack of feeling of purpose, sense of belonging, what binds us together as a group, then I think you do get this low energy level and this status quo.
I'd like to build off that. For me, I think the danger of talking about innovation and landing on elements which are separate by themselves, for me including leadership and the various manifestations, is where I think we even start to get into trouble, because the actual container, the context for innovation actually in many respects is what's the quality of our well-being. And I think it's interesting how it's come up in a couple of conversations. It's not just the well-being of the present, but it's actually the things from the past which are contributing to how we are in the present. And if you took a gardening metaphor, you know, the seeds of innovation, or what the gardener does, is actually governed in many respects by the quality of the soil, by the quality of the water, by the quality of the air. And there are these sort of invisibles which exist within an organisational culture, which are very hard to pin down. But if you don't, then the weeds beat the plants.
It was interesting that the other day, Chris and I, as you mentioned, were working with a group and a client, and we were actually trying to teach people to be leaders of innovation. So we got them to a point where we were starting to talk about, actually, it's not good and bad, actually everything is subjective. How do you start to kind of work in a way in which you can really appreciate people's points of view and be creative around that? And there was a moment in this workshop when a senior leader came in reasonably unexpectedly in the middle of some really creative presentations, and sat down, and we said, well, what do you think? And he kind of like said, well, I don't agree with that, and I don't agree with that. And, it's like, and in the moment, kind of like, it was almost, you felt the climate of the room change. It kind of chilled slightly, and the moment was lost. And I'm curious about this notion of muscle, of how resilient an organisation can be. Because there was a choice at that time when we, they, us could have said, well, actually, there's an opportunity here to think differently, but we didn't. We kind of accepted it. And so it was the fragile nature of, actually, we're on this, we're creative, we're innovative, and then bang, no, now we're not. So how do you build muscle?
I think we're talking here partly as well, aren't we, about leaders as story makers or as sources of stories, and about the choices that we have when in a situation which is a story creating situation to tell one story or another. And the three of you who are in the same situation have chosen a slightly different story, but leaders seeing themselves as story makers and acknowledging that role and knowing the importance of it can either disable innovation or enthuse it. And I think consciously constrain oneself in that way is very important.
There's another thing for me that's come out of this conversation actually, and that's the whole concept of time and how we hold time. There's a timing element, but also just that whole idea of actually both within ourselves and as society, are we driven by time? So we talk about measurement and the whole targets, and you've got to hit a certain thing within the contract and so on. And potentially at different levels within the organisation as well. So your senior executive, chief executive says, I'm thinking 10 years out and I want everybody to be innovative and think of new products, and genuinely believes it and is open to that. And then as it cascades down and it becomes shorter and shorter time frames and the target then becomes very specific.
I really agree with that. And I think this whole notion of time is really interesting in organisations. And I was having a conversation the other day and somebody was saying, well, actually, what we're trying to do is get ourselves so organised that we create time for innovation. My hypothesis is that actually, in terms of any kind of work, level of workload, there's always 10 times more work than any organisations can actually take on. So there's always just no time. So my notion of time is more around what you brought forward, which is that actually in terms of cultures of innovation, there are moments. There are kind of like just almost minutes and seconds where you take a breath or you have that conversation just to unpack that piece, which allows you to kind of reconnect. And it's almost that it's around critical moments rather than trying to, can we spend 2 weeks on a project? It's almost, it happens in a minute.